Okay, it's now time to start our first webinar of this series. Again, my name is Caesar. I'm with the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development, and welcome to our first webinar on the 2019 California Building Standards Code as applied to buildings regulated by OSHPD. A couple of housekeeping items. Please know that all of you will be muted during the presentation. We will be taking questions via the question box on the GoToWebinar tool settings. And please know that we're going to be collecting your questions and we're going to answer them towards the end of the presentation in our Q&A session. If you can, please keep your questions in a more generic sense. And if you have specific questions for specific projects, please feel free to email us at regsunit@oshpod.ca.gov, or an alternate email address would be fdd.webinar@oshpod.ca.gov. So again, with that, thank you, and know that towards the end of the presentation, you will receive a survey. And so please feel free to fill that out and send it back to us so we can keep improving our webinar series. And with that being said, I'm going to hand it off to Mr. Richard Tannehill, who will be presenting this awesome presentation.
Thank you, Caesar. Hello, everyone. This is not only the first webinar in this series for the 2019 code change, it's also the first webinar that we're doing in OSHPD's new studio. So we may have some technical difficulties that we're going to be working through, so bear with us on that, but hopefully not. The first question I'm going to have to you, can you ask that you raise your hands, make sure everyone can hear us, because we don't have an outside connection.
Yes.
Okay, I see some hands going up. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. This is an introduction to the 2019 Building Standards Code. We'll be covering a lot of information in 4 sessions as we go through. So what we're doing to get the 2019 code together, what we do is we take the International Building Code, we take the 2016 Building Code cycle, and then we take the OSHPD amendments that have previously been submitted as well as the future ones that we're proposing, put that all together, and we get the 2019 CBSC, the whole Building Standards Code. And today we'll be looking at the major highlights. We have an intro to OSHPD 1R. We'll kind of walk through what that is and how it's applied, what it means. We'll also go over Part 10 for the existing building code and Part 1 of the administrative code today. Other items that we'll be looking at will be coming in the future sessions are Parts 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Those are kind of the primary changes that were made in the 2019 code. So session 1 today, as I mentioned, is the 1R and Part 10 and Part 1. There are 3 other sessions, and these are the dates and the content, so you can sign up for which ones you need. Please note that you do have to register for each one independently. And also, we had a lot of questions that a lot of people were originally intending to watch these in the conference room at their office with all their staff. If that is the case, everybody does need to sign up and register independently if they're going to be viewing these from home. So as Caesar mentioned, we anticipate questions. Go ahead and put your questions in the question box as we go through, and we'll have time at the end to answer those questions, but we're going to go straight through this first. We have a lot of information to cover. So let's get started with session 1. Starting with the introduction to the 1R. This is a new concept for this code cycle, and we'll kind of go through kind of a series of discussions of how we came to that and what it actually means. So per the California Administrative Code, a hospital building from which care services and beds have been removed or a non-conforming hospital building without SBC or NPC ratings shall not provide general acute care services unless modified to comply. This kind of takes to me, the opposite approach. You have an existing acute care service building. Your NPC and SBC ratings may not be up to the current requirements, so you're going to remove that building from acute care service. That is a building that could potentially be a 1R building. So looking at the history of a lot of the hospitals is that they originally start out with a building back in the 50s or 60s, a long time ago. And as time goes on, we expand to a nursing tower. We put in a replacement hospital and another nursing tower, et cetera, and it grows. What we end up with is a conglomerate of a bunch of different structures that we call the hospital. So what we're looking at doing when we remove these buildings from acute care service, you can tell by the cluster and the proximity of the other buildings, this can be quite complicated or difficult to do. So that's where the 1R classification comes in, and we'll go into the details on that. But basically what we're showing is the basic services here, the nursing, surgical, et cetera, have to be removed from the building that's going to be removed from acute care services. So all these services have to be relocated into the replacement hospital or elsewhere so that there are no acute care services remaining in the building being removed from acute care. So the timeline on this is SBC1 buildings need to be removed from service by January 1st, 2020. That date has already passed. There are approximately about 60 buildings still remaining in our inventory that are in the process of being removed from service or updated. SBC2 buildings have till 2030. Okay. And this is where a lot of these removal from acute care service or RACS type projects will take effect. So back to our diagram here, you'll see this a lot as we go through this. There's different opportunities to repurpose the building that's being removed from acute care services. A lot of cases, they're either being torn down or replaced. They can be repurposed into a 1R or a non-OSHPD building, or they can be upgraded to comply with the standards for SPC and NPC. Here we're showing an SPC1 building, and again, an SPC2 does need to be removed from service by 2030 unless the law changes by then. So now we're going to look at what is a 1R building. Buildings that previously provided basic or supplemental services that have been removed from acute care service in compliance with Part 10. We'll go over Part 10. It's an existing building code. A lot of people, it's newer for the hospitals. And so it's removed from acute care service and it remains under the jurisdiction of OSHPD. Those are the requirements for a 1R building. When the removal of the general acute care, this can cause a change of use, change of occupancy, change of function, change of licensure, combination of these. So you can have different floors with different uses. There's a lot of opportunities and options that are available to reuse these buildings. The other option is it can go to the local jurisdictions. These have their own pros and cons, and we'll cover those later on. So is the building freestanding or not? Let me go into some quick definitions of what that is. When buildings were, as we said, when hospitals expanded over the years, the requirement for the seismic separation was less if it remained as a hospital to a hospital than if it was removed from OSHPD jurisdiction. There was a larger requirement. Again, we'll cover that later on. So what we have is a non-freestanding building that remains under OSHPD jurisdiction. And then we have a freestanding building that is separated by a structural separation. And again, the requirement here is a little bit larger. For these freestanding buildings, and it doesn't have to be this close, it can be in the parking lot elsewhere, it can remain under OSHPD jurisdiction if it has qualifying services. And they also have to meet the height and area limits for buildings on the same lot. Here's some terms that we're going to go over, and we'll hit those. Okay, the term building is sometimes can get confusing, especially when it comes to OSHPD, because we have SBC buildings and hospital buildings and just buildings. And it's used in the law differently, but we're trying to standardize how they're applied. So for the purpose of removing the general acute care services, we've added some definitions in Part 10, which is the California Existing Building Code. And we also have a CAN that's listed here that has explanations on this as well. So the definition of a building is the area included within the surrounding exterior walls or combination of exterior walls. So basically the building is, when you look at a hospital, it's what you see, the whole surrounding building as a whole. When you look at SBC buildings, those are the individual structures that define that building, where they're separated by the seismic separations. So for an SBC seismic separation, it's a building separated in accordance with administrative code. Basically, what this says is if it's within 2 inches times the number of stories away from the building being evaluated, it can be a seismic separation. This is a lot less requirement as if it was not a hospital building. For a structural separation, the gap between the adjacent structures is sufficient to avoid damage and contact, complying with the current structural provisions shown here. And I'm not going to go into the detail on this calculation, but the result is there's a wider seismic separation or structural separation required on these buildings. So now I'm going to go over a quick definition of the freestanding options for hospital buildings. You have detached hospital building, means a building containing general acute care service that meets the following criteria. Here, the structural separation shall comply with the applicable provisions of the building code, and the fire ratings have to comply. And buildings on the same lot will comply with the height and area limitations. Now I'm going to jump over to a freestanding non-hospital building, which is a building that does not contain any general acute care services. And look at the requirements for this criteria. They're identical to the other one. So that's been adding a lot of confusion. But basically, a freestanding non-hospital building can be used for many types of uses and functions, whereas a detached hospital building containing general acute care services, you're going to kind of be limited to psychiatric and skilled nursing facilities in these buildings, even though the definitions are the same. You have to have, again, a qualifying service. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. I was jumping between the slides, but they basically say the same thing other than the definition itself. So going some quick fire terms, because this is related to how the buildings are separated. So if you're not freestanding, again, not only do you have a benefit and a lesser seismic separation, you also have a benefit of a fire barrier can be used to separate the occupancies. Again, the reason this is because the building is remaining under OSHPD jurisdiction. Any changes to that building, any future projects will come through OSHPD, and we can kind of monitor what services are going in there. And they may not even be healthcare related, but there are several options for that, and we'll go into that as well. So when you have a fire barrier, fire resistant rated wall assembly and materials designed to restrict the spread of fire in which continuity is maintained. Basically, it depends on the adjacent occupancy as to the fire rating level required. So this is what we're trying to avoid, is the fire wall. When you get into a freestanding situation, again, you have a larger structural separation required, but you also have a firewall requirement, which means basically, we'll go over this in detail, but if one building falls down, it doesn't affect the other one. So the area of a building is also calculated. So the height and the width or the area has to be calculated per the California Building Code for the footprint, and it has to meet the requirements for 2 buildings on the same site. I'm not going to go to how to do that, but just saying that it does apply. And buildings that have overhangs, it goes by the furthest outside dimension or footprint is the area that you would use for that calculation. Okay, the code allows for buildings to be viewed as one if the height and area and story limitations are met. However, they've never considered buildings on the same lot under different jurisdictions. It's always been under the same jurisdiction, either the locals or under OSHPD. So buildings are defined as noted in the previous slides, surrounded by exterior firewalls. In order to have 2 buildings under different jurisdictions, the building walls shall be defined by the exterior walls or firewalls in accordance with the CBC. I'm going to jump back, kind of show you, this is what we're talking about. So this is going to be your separate building. And that's why you have the firewall. Okay. So with each portion of a building separated by 1 or more firewalls that comply with the provision of this section shall be considered a separate building. Okay, the big thing here is if one building falls, collapses due to the fire, the other one is not affected or affected minimally by the fall. Okay, if you have a different occupancies in the different buildings, the most restrictive requirements of the separation shall apply. Okay, this basically just says what I just said, that the wall shall be designed and constructed to allow collapse of a structure on either side without the collapse of wall under the fire conditions. And here's an example of that happening. This is not a hospital, but it did have firewalls, and you can see this area, this building caught on fire, but yet the adjacent buildings are minimally affected. So the fire resistant ratings, again, are based on occupancy, what's going next door, and the fire rating must be on the hospital side. Now, local jurisdictions may have a requirement that it be on their side as well. So that's something to consider. We've had several projects come in that they are actually doing projects to expand the structural separation, make it larger so they can go to local jurisdictions. After going to the locals to find out what would be required, the locals are actually requiring them to upgrade their firewalls, their structure, their accessibility, everything within it. And so the benefit of going there was diminished, and they came back and said, you know, we're going to keep this under OSHPD. So we're not that bad all the time. We do have our benefits. But anyway, double firewalls may be required. Okay, this is just an FYI slide. CMS actually has a new requirement. It's started in 2018, where they are requiring that any high-rise building, new and existing, be fully sprinklered. There's a 10-year period to get this into effect. So by 2028, all buildings have to be, all high-rise buildings have to be fully sprinklered. And what this does is we're allowing some leniency for projects that do not intend to remain under OSHPD jurisdiction beyond 2030. We're not requiring certain upgrades to be done for SPC and NPC. And what this is basically saying, though, if you have a building without fire sprinklers, by 2028, they have to be sprinklered. So we have a 2-year gap between 2030 and 2028 that we wouldn't have required it, but they are being required a little earlier. So it's just something to consider when you're doing your planning into the future. So how do you become an OSHPD 1R? First, you want to decide on the jurisdiction. Do you want to go to the locals or you want to stay with OSHPD? So this is a real quick flow chart here. So you want to complete project to remove general acute care services and modify infrastructure, fire life safety infrastructure as needed. You go with OSHPD, you just submit the project to OSHPD. There's going to be a series of projects to make this happen. We'll go over that also in a little bit. And then you end up with a final application, non-construction, just to verify the work was done. If you want to go to the locals, you have the same requirements to remove the services and the utilities, but you also have to do the work to make it a freestanding building. Part of that is consulting your local HJ for added requirements that they may have. Like I said, sometimes they have requirements that are above and beyond what OSHPD requires, and some of them don't. And then you have to show evidence that the locals acknowledge that. And again, you have to go through the same process, a series of projects to show that you're meeting the requirements. And then you do a final application to remove it. It's just a verification, non-construction, and we remove it from our inventory, and the building gets turned over to the local jurisdictions. So this is what's required. You have to remove general acute care services. The utilities have to be, cannot traverse from one side to the other without modification. There are exceptions to that. And this will affect mechanical, plumbing, your med gases, electrical, fire suppression alarm, and other things as necessary. And the exiting through the SPC building is not permitted as a means of egress from the acute care hospital. Can go the other way, and we'll cover that. So we came up with an acronym for FUSE. You want your fire protection and fire detection, and detection to be split between the systems. If there's a shared controller, it must be on the hospital side. You have to isolate your utilities. You have to provide the appropriate seismic separation, and you have to provide for egress without going through the RACS building, the 1R building. So again, fire alarm, fire sprinklers be on separate systems. If they are shared, they can only go from the hospital to the 1R, and they must have shut-off valves in case something happens to the 1R building, that their operation isn't disrupted to the hospital. Vacant spaces have to be addressed, and this is 1R or not. If you're doing a project, you're opening up a new hospital and you're moving your occupants from an older space into the new space, and you're leaving a lot of space vacated, even for a temporary time, there should be a project to address that condition, either securing the doors, making sure there's the trap primers are either cleared or sealed, isolating any cutoffs or dead legs in the water system, things like that. So in CBC 116, we talk about the conditions that need to be met. So we want to make sure that the conditions are not unsafe or insanitary. That you don't have any deficiencies from inadequate means of egress, lighting, or ventilation. That there are no fire hazards or dangers to human life or public welfare. And we want to make sure there's no unsafe conditions due to illegal occupancy, people moving their offices in there, sleeping in there, inadequate maintenance. A lot of these places, they like to keep them running, which is good, but they need to be maintained and secured against unauthorized entry. So there are requirements that need to be met, like I said, locked door, signage, and emptying the traps on the plumbing to make sure that they're not drying out. Okay, so when we're looking at removal acute care services, again, this is kind of repetitive, but these are the steps we need to go through. Make sure you have the proper seismic separation. And this is done, again, it could be over a period of time. It could be started already with projects that are already doing NPC, SPC work. They can be all accumulated to turn in for your final project to show compliance. Okay, we want to make sure your cross-corridor doors are not preventing egress from spaces of adjacent buildings. You want to make sure you have the proper fire barrier installed or being installed. Make sure that the elevators don't dump from one building into another. And there's going to be a series of remodels to make this happen. So those projects can be done as one or as individual ones that address different areas. We've seen all types come through. And again, you're ending up with a final project that's more of just showing compliance. So flex connections at the seismic separations can be used. You have to provide disconnect switches at the utilities, again, on the hospital side. And some of these are automatic, and some of them, like med gases, cannot be. They have to fail safe or operational. And same with the emergency shutoffs. And again, just rerouting the utilities so that they are complying with the requirements of the existing building code. That basically, if you're familiar with the SBC 1-2, that you can't route utilities from an older building into the newer one. And again, addressing the egress, you can egress from a 1R back into the hospital, but you cannot exit from the hospital into a 1R building. Okay, on our website, there's also, it's actually an older one, but it's the same process for removal of acute care services. There's a guide that can be downloaded, and here's the address. And you can, these handouts will be available. We're going to post them probably either later today or in the next couple of days. So let's get into part 10. We just covered the 1R stuff. You'll see that coming up a lot as we go through almost all of the volumes or parts of the code, because that was one of the significant changes. So a lot of even the mechanical, electrical are being modified to accept the 1R. So you'll see that coming up a lot. But we'll go into part 10, which also addresses this as well. So part 10 for hospitals used to be in chapter 34A. We were asked, why isn't it in the existing building code as it applies to existing construction? So it was moved into 309A. And this little chart here, chapter 3A. This little chart shows where things, if you have additions or alterations, went from 304.1A to 301A and so forth down the line here. But there's a little cheat sheet to help you find what you might have been looking for in 34A previously. Again, a lot of this is just renaming chapters. This was moved from 3419 to 310A, and we just clarified a lot of the language to identify and added a banner for OSHPD 1R in these. So you have non-general acute care buildings, now called OSHPD 1R, freestanding buildings, also refer what would apply if they were 1R. Please note that an OSHPD 1R building is a building type. We really only use it for tracking and not for the occupancy that's going into it. The occupancy can still be a 2, 3, 5, or a B, whatever it might be. The 1R is really for the building type, and where the 1R will apply for these for the building code is actually if there are requirements for the building itself. If the example would be if the utilities are coming over and being supported from the hospital and looping back, those utilities have to meet the same requirements as the hospital. But as far as the occupancies within them, they all go to the occupancy that is being installed. Okay, a change of function. This has been added to our remodel can. Change of function shall require compliance with all the functional requirements for new construction. So just the functional requirements that are being added are changed. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but if you're going from a med surg to a pediatric unit, the pediatric unit has additional functional requirements. Those do have to be added. The rooms are patient rooms. If they remain patient rooms, no upgrades are required to those patient rooms, not for accessibility, not for operations. Okay, those rooms may remain as they were. Okay, we did add an exception for 1R buildings. My opinion, this exception probably is kind of redundant from what I just said. But basically, if you remove a hospital from acute care services, the room sizes are typically going to be smaller than what's currently required in the code. And now you're putting a skilled nursing facility or psychiatric unit, even outpatient services in that area. The room sizes can go to pre-2001 sizes for these new uses if they're considered a new use. So that's going to be a great benefit to the facilities to be able to repurpose these buildings. One of the things that has been happening is when we have, as I mentioned, a hospital building is the whole series of SPC buildings clumped together. When one of these buildings is removed from acute care service, there's nothing that tells you that as you're walking through a corridor and you're stepping over a almost invisible seismic cover plate that you're leaving the hospital and going into a non-acute care building. So signage is going to be required saying no general acute care service beyond this point. This also helps with licensing and for people just putting services within their building thinking, well, it's part of the hospital, when the reality it is a non-OSHPD building or a non-acute care building, I should say. So part 10, we're also defining substantial structural damage. They're actually reducing the percentage in the calculations for this but just so you know, one of the things that did happen when they printed the 2019 code is when we made this change, it meant to be for OSHPD 1 and 4 only. They revised the model code language to reflect these new numbers that will be being corrected in the future intervening cycle code that's going to be being produced right now. So just keep that in mind that the 33% still applies to non-OSHPD buildings and it's 10% currently for OSHPD. Okay, this is getting back into the service and utilities, traveling from one building to another. The systems and utilities shall only originate in, pass through, or under structures which are under the jurisdiction of OSHPD. That doesn't mean any building that's under the jurisdiction of OSHPD. You still have to look at the uses. If it's a 1R, you can't originate in a 1R and serve the hospital. And those are defined in individual sections in Part 10. Again, the means of egress through existing buildings shall be in accordance with the California Building Code and shall only pass through buildings that are under the jurisdiction of OSHPD. Same thing here applies. If there are other areas that say you cannot egress from an OSHPD 1R into the OSHPD 1 building, that would still apply. Okay, then the Part 1 going into Part 10, kind of jumping around a little bit, apologize. Going into Part 1 for the administrative code. NPC 4D is coming. This is in response to the 2030 deadlines for compliance. There are several things to consider here. When you're looking at NPC category, seismic category D, you have to meet that requirement by 2030. Okay, the other requirements actually, the dates have already passed to meet those with the extensions. There are a few extensions out there for the NPC 3 or 3R. This will make more sense when I get to the next couple slides. So there's 100 buildings at 25 facilities are still NPC 1. NPC 2 was required by 2002. It's more than 17 years overdue on those. Under Chapter 6, under the Article 1, if a building is less than NPC 2 client, no building permits after January 2020 will be accepted for review unless they are specifically to address seismic compliance, maintenance, or emergency repairs. Okay, here's the status from 2001 compared to 2018, where we had 74% of our buildings are NPC 1. Now we're down to 4%. But you can still see there's a large amount of NPC 2 buildings out there, 58%. that still are being addressed. So what provisions do we have for these for SPC2 buildings coming in? Again, here's our SPC2 building in the diagram. Do we rebuild, repurpose, or upgrade? So after January 2030, these buildings must have general acute care services removed from them if they have not been upgraded to NPC 5 and SPC 3, 4, 4D, or 5. Okay. To continue to general acute care services beyond 2030, I'll go over some dates here on a slide coming up, you must notify OSHPD of the intent to upgrade. And if you're going to remove acute services, you also need to notify us of the intent that they will not be upgrading and will be removed from acute care service. And again, that's because there is some leniency allowed. If you're doing a new project, not all the same requirements are going to be required of you to upgrade or do that project, because you won't have to worry about the NPC upgrade. So that just gives us a flag to put in our system to tell the reviewers these things do not need to be upgraded because it's going to be removed from acute care service. So if you intend to complete SPC upgrades, here's the dates I was talking about. By January 2024, you have to notify us or OSHPD with a complete non-structural evaluation that you intend to upgrade to NPC 4, 4D, and NPC 5. Okay. By January 2026, you have to notify us that they're deemed ready have drawings ready for review by the office for each building to remain in acute care service. So 2024, we have to be notified. By 2026, we need construction drawings. By 2028, the facility should have obtained a building permit to begin the construction to change that. Okay, if it's not done, the hospital will not get any further permits other than seismic compliance, maintenance, and emergency repairs. Okay, just a kind of reminder, the hospitals must be NPC 4 or NPC 4D and NPC 5 compliant by 2030. There are different requirements there, so that's why the and. NPC work to be included in remodels and renovations after January 2028. Buildings with NPC ratings less than 4 shall include anchorage or bracing for all equipment and services within the boundary of the scope of work for compliance. So after 2028, all your projects need to address the NPC requirements to upgrade those. This is if you're upgrading, because there are exceptions, and we'll go over those right now. Remodel, renovations, or other construction work that remove room or space from a service use or occupancy for less than 24 hours. So basically it's temporary. You don't have to worry about it. If there's 20% or less of the affected existing structure is to be removed to access equipment and services for anchorage. Again, that's an exception. And exception 3 is buildings that have been removed from a general acute care service do not meet that requirement. So no additional anchorage would be required after that time. Okay, the new non-structural performance category, NPC 4D, what is that? So what we're looking at is really there's new dates associated with this category, but there's 3 levels of compliance. It's actually pretty easy to meet. A operational plan is required that identifies what will happen in case of emergency, and I'll go through those levels. Level 1 is all systems and equipment required to comply with NPC as revised, plus the operational plan. Level 2 is level 1 and all service and utilities as necessary to accommodate continuation of operations after an event. These get really into the nitty-gritty of the differences, but these services are anchored and braced and shall include elevators selected to provide service to the patients. And then level 3 includes level 2 plus all system equipment to be anchored and braced, and additional services determined by the hospital in its operational plan. So level 1 is the easiest, or I shouldn't say easiest, it's the least compliant, and would require an operational plan that would show what would happen if anything happened during an event or emergency. Level 2, you're getting a little further along. Level 3, you're almost all the way there. So the requirements for the operational plan will be less. Okay, for minimum compliance for NPC 4D, the facility must prepare an owner approved, that's the key word here, owner approved, not OSHPD approved. It's an owner approved operational plan specifying how it will repair non-structural damage and bring the systems back online in the case of an emergency or critical care operation. Okay. Sorry, this stuff is a little dry, but it's new and there's a lot of requirements for it. So speaking of dry, a sip of water, sorry. Okay, the operational plan may include other units or departments in the hospital wish to keep operational for a minimum of 72 hours after a seismic event or natural or human-made disaster, similar to what we're going through now. Operational plan shall be filed with the office and shall be included executive summary, detailed narrative, provisions, sustainability, alternate means. Again, this is owner approved, but it is filed with OSHPD. We do not approve it. And it will include bracings of ceilings of less than 300 square feet, wall and floor mounted cabinets, elevator guide rails, tanks and vessels, and the load path check may be limited to connection of the equipment to support equipment. Okay, I went through that pretty quick, but everything's going to be here for you to read. I'm not a structural engineer, but these are the basic requirements of the operational plan. For buildings intended to remain at SBC2 and not go into beyond 2030, they're going to remove general acute care services. It's a little bit easier. By January 2024, you need to notify our office that you are removing, the buildings are intended to be removed from acute care service beyond and not go beyond 2030. By 2028, the hospital shall submit a RACS project that includes construction documents to show that they're moving forward. Okay, the services and utilities from the buildings are permitted to pass through or under buildings that have been removed from acute care service only if the following conditions are met. The building is removed from acute care service, remains under OSHPD jurisdiction, that they only support SBC 1 or 2 buildings where no critical care hospital functions occur. It's critical care hospital functions occur in it. And the SBC 1 or SBC 2 buildings must be NPC 2 and served with essential power from a conforming building, which does not pass through or under a building removed from acute care service. The SBC 2 building must be removed from acute care service no later than January 2026. And that's if you're going to have the utilities running through it. Okay, here's a quick chart showing kind of the dates and the cutoffs. If SBC 1 should have been done by now, SBC 2 removed from acute care services. If you're removing acute care service by 2020, you can remain NPC 2 indefinitely. And then the rest are all the same. You have to be NPC 3 by January 2024. Again, it depends on your seismic classification here, F and D and F. You have to be NPC 4 or 4D and 5 by 2030. I know that causes some confusion, but it's 4D or 4 or 4D and 5. There's different requirements there. Use of pre-approvals. Okay, getting away from the NPC stuff. Okay, when you're using pre-approved details, we really encourage this. They're very useful, but the design professional and the engineers using them are responsible for making sure they comply with the building or the project that they're doing. Okay, so basically what we're saying is look at the details, make sure they are applicable to the type of construction and so forth. Stamping and signing of the construction drawings are required and by the CAC, the administrative code, and shall be continuing to be used for this purpose. Okay. So what you would do is put the pre-approved details on a sheet, and then engineer of record or the design professional of record will stamp and sign, or sign, depending on their authority, that sheet. But the details themselves, typically only reviewed by us for applicability and not for content. So it goes really fast. When pre-approvals are used, like I said, they shall be incorporated into the construction documents. You cannot reference them, say, per pre-approval book, whatever number, we're going to do this. Now, they have to be added to the documents. That's why I said you paste them onto a sheet or copy and paste them on, however you're going to do it. And they must be incorporated without any modification. Once you modify it, you just remove the pre-approval, and they have to be reviewed as a regular detail at that point. Pre-approval is submitted after construction has started, after it's been approved and you want to make some changes. Actually, this is really easy. You can do it as an ASI if you're not modifying the general concept of it. You're just replacing one detail for another. If they're pre-approved, you can do it as an ASI or an SI. So it's considered non-material altered. Okay. There's some confusion, but if they're material altered, because it says that you're modifying the construction documents, but it is non-material altered, and you can trade out a pre-approved detail for another pre-approved detail. Also with pre-approved details, you have to comply with the manufacturer's instructions. And anything not covered by the approval will need to be substantiated with drawings, specs, calculations, and stamped and signed by the registered professional, just like you would a regular detail. Okay, for the energy code, there's one mention in part 1 that I just want to bring up that basically says if you're doing a new project, an expansion, new building, an addition, that there are requirements for the new energy code that come into effect. If you're doing a remodel only, it is exempt from this currently, and nothing's required. But if you are doing a new project, the 4 systems that we're looking at is HVAC systems, indoor lighting systems, water heating system efficiencies, and the building envelope considerations, where a basis of design is required for those per part 6. But remember, this is for only new elements and for additions and new buildings only. We will be talking about part 6 in one of the other sessions, and we'll go into more detail about that. Okay, we did modify the fees for OSHPD OSPs, which is your special seismic certification pre-approvals. They are hourly now, and with a minimum filing fee of $250. There are some administrative some changes here. I was pointing out the IOR shall maintain a log of changes to the work prepared by the architect or engineer in responsible charge. The IOR only has to maintain a log. It's the architect or the engineer of record that is responsible for the TIO. The definition for personal knowledge has been modified for the verified compliance reports. Basically, all it says is personal knowledge is applied to the architect, engineer, etc., shall be in accordance with Health and Safety Code 129830. Just the language has been revised a little, nothing that's going to change the way we work. Certification and approval of hospital inspectors. Various sections have been modified. We're not going to go into detail of what those are, but the qualifications and testing criteria have been modified. And there are just a modification to Class B still coming in the intervening, just requiring certain levels of experience. So that concludes what I'm talking about today. We do encourage you all to be involved in our process. We have a hospital building safety board that we do have a code committee that we discuss future codes. If you have ideas, you can also email them to us or ask questions of us or make proposals to us. But we want to encourage you to be involved in the process. We're trying to do the best we can to make these codes more clear, more understandable, more easy to apply. So again, we encourage your participation. So we're going to go into our question and answer. Sorry, I have a timer on this. It keeps changing my slide on me. The email addresses you see here is our regs unit, and this is our webinar website email address. If you have questions, you can post them there after the fact, or if you have any questions about the webinars in general or regulations, you can talk to the regs unit or FDD webinar site. So we're going to go into the Q&A period. So bear with me a second as I look through these. Okay, here, I gotta go to a different screen, so 1 second. I have to get past all the "we can't hear you" emails.
Why don't I send them to you?
Okay, one of the questions we have is, when are double firewalls required? A firewall by nature is actually 2 walls. The way they're constructed, again, there are ways to get around that, but they're very, very difficult and costly to do. But a double firewall are pretty much standard. If we're talking about the fire barriers, then from the other slide, so we do require a fire barrier on the OSHPD side of the building, or the firewall on the OSHPD side of the building. And that they are also applied on, could be applied on the enforcing agency. The local may require their own requirements for the fire protection on that side. But basically, we require, I think it's a minimum of 3 hours on the OSHPD side of the building, and there can't be any, for freestanding, there's not going to be any structural attachments. But if we're talking again about fire barriers, they can be split between the two, because again, it remains under OSHPD jurisdiction.
Great, Richard. Next question that we have is, what are, as it relates to OSHPD 1R, what are the pros and cons?
The pros and cons to a 1R is, the biggest thing is you don't have the seismic or the structural separation required. Like I said, I've had several projects come through where they're actually adding new columns to increase that structural separation, and that's very, very costly, plus the firewalls involved in that. Some people will say the pro of removing it from OSHPD jurisdiction is you don't have to deal with OSHPD for any future remodels in that space. Again, you have to weigh those cons out with the requirements of the local enforcement agency of what they're going to require. I've actually heard them say that if OSHPD doesn't want it, if they consider it a collapse hazard, we don't want it either. So you need to bring it up to full compliance. And now that's might be the exception rather than the rule. But there's definitely could be an advantage to that if you keep it under OSHPD jurisdiction. Again, most of the complaints there are the review times, but these will be reviewed under model code, even if they're under OSHPD jurisdiction. Again, it's based on the occupancy, not the building.
All right, next question we have is, as it relates to OSHPD 1R, why keep it as an OSHPD 1R versus a non-OSHPD service?
Can you repeat that question?
Why keep it as an OSHPD 1R versus a non-OSHPD service?
Kind of the same reasoning. Really, it's really the cost of separating them out. You keep it as a 1R, you don't have the separation issues to deal with for separating the buildings. Now remember, if you do have a freestanding building, they can keep supporting hospital services within there, like redundant services above and beyond what's the basic services required in the hospital. The hospital building must have all the requirements to maintain operations within that building, but the other building can be used for additional storage. Might have a second kitchen over there that's not required, but can provide food, materials management, a lot of other services can go in there. But really the advantage is not having the cost of separating the buildings.
Very good. Last question as it pertains to OSHPD 1R. Does this apply to behavioral health systems with patient and acute care, but not medical?
If I understand the question, you can put behavioral health patients in a 1R building. Even though it's an acute care psychiatric, it can go in a 1R building because you don't have the requirements for the NPC SPC ratings. Same with the skilled nursing facility. We're seeing a lot of these buildings converted to skilled nursing facilities, psychiatric facilities, outpatient observation units, and even doctor sleep rooms. A lot of healthcare uses are remaining in these buildings, but that's not required. They can become almost anything, be occupancies. They can be leased to other facilities. They can be leased floor by floor to different doctors or organizations.
Very well. Moving on to the next topic. As it relates to the California existing building code, if a pre-approved detail was not in the approved contract document set and needed to be added in, does it have to be submitted as an ACD?
Good question. Right now, I'm going to say yes, because it was not previously submitted. It's kind of the replacement of details. Let me think about that for a second. The whole idea that these pre-approved details are provided is so that because they already reviewed, they already applied the review. So I'm going to reverse that answer and say yes, it's a non-material altered. They can be added to a project as an ASI. Now the IOR and the compliance officer, after the design professionals have verified it, will check compliance with that, and they can be issued as an ASI. One of the questions we get a lot is any type UL detail, can they be done as an ASI as well, because they are also considered, in a sense, pre-approved. As of now, no, they will be submitted as ACDs. We are looking at that. If you look at the language, it does talk about referenced, certified reference drawings, may be non-material altered. But as of right now, those will be added as an ACD. But OSHPD pre-approvals can be issued as ASIs or an SI.
Perfect. And next subject, as it relates to the California Administrative Code, can you go over the use of pre-approvals again, please?
Okay, the way we do pre-approvals, on our website, we have ones for fire, we have them for ceilings, we have for wall construction. There's a lot of pre-approvals on there. What you need to do is select the pre-approved details that apply to your project. You don't want to put them all in there. You don't want to put a whole book in there. They need to be specific to the project. And they have to be cut and pasted onto one of your drawing sheets, title blocks, and stamped and signed by the engineer that's overseeing that review and signed by the design professional of record. Again, the signature only by the design professional. Now, maybe the architect's doing both, in which case they do need to stamp and sign it, but that would suffice. Once they are submitted, we just check them for applicability and move on. So that sheet is really, in a sense, skipped over. We just make sure they apply to the type of construction that's being done. And that's really it. And they're really, again, they're really useful in the field because they can be swapped out for other pre-approved details or added to. We actually surprisingly see very few projects that use these. There are some firms that they use them exclusively. which again really expedites the process.
Perfect. And to continue on with the pre-approval subject, the section on usage of pre-approved details, is this applicable to the new code revisions or has it been applicable since before?
It's applicable from previous. They are good for, I believe, I want to say 2 code cycles. But they've been in use for a few years now. And it's actually not a code thing, it's an OSHPD. There's a can on that. But they have been around.
Very good. Again, with pre-approvals, if we were to email you, would you be able to provide an example or maybe share an example of a owner-approved operations plan for NPC 4D?
As mentioned earlier, OSHPD does not approve them. We only file them. So actually, if you email me that information, I can get you a better answer. To be honest, I have not seen any come in, but they would go to the seismic compliance unit and not the general plan review staff. So go ahead and email me your question and I can answer it more specifically. But again, we have not seen a whole lot of these come in yet.
Very good. Moving on to the 1R subject, can you explain the benefits of being 1R instead of downgrading to a B occupancy?
Again, 1R is a building type. It's not an occupancy. So once you have a 1R building, you can put a B occupancy in there. You can put an A occupancy in there. You can put an OSHPD 2, 4, or not 4, 3 or 5. Again, the OSHPD 1R is not an occupancy type. It's just a way to track the building. The building itself can be used for almost anything. Again, we keep it under OSHPD jurisdiction so that somebody's not putting a fireworks factory in there or anything hazardous. So, so if you do the 1R, it's really, there's a benefit. If you're talking about downgrading the 1R to a B, you're really going from an OSHPD 1 to a B. The benefits there is just, you do have to meet the requirements of the B. An OSHPD 1 project may not have door closers or rated doors in the patient rooms. If those are being converted to a B area with offices, you may have to rate those doors or provide door closers. So it's just a matter of the occupancy. You need to meet the requirements of the occupancy going to the space. So that benefit would have to be something that the designer or the facility have to weigh. We can always meet with you ahead of time to discuss options. So we had a lot of conversations on this. We have seen several go through prior to the 2019 code change, but we're familiar with the process.
All right, thank you. Next question. Can the fire barrier at an OSHPD 1 building be set back from seismic separation, such as at a corridor intersection where the rated doors need to be recessed from the perpendicular corridor in the GAC so they do not block that corridor?
That one I would have to ask you to submit a PDF of the drawings. Normally, or better yet, wait 2 weeks and ask Nancy that. Our Chief Fire Life Safety Officer, Nancy Timmons, will be presenting in 2 weeks on the Fire Life Safety Code, and she addresses that in detail. But if you have a specific question or something for us to look at, and this goes for all questions, we have people all the time telling us they don't want to bother us. Send a PDF with a question. If it's a simple question, it's a simple PDF, we can answer that question very easily and get an answer to you turned around usually within the same day, if not, next couple days.
All right, we're almost out of time, so we're going to go through these fairly quickly. If a proposed OSHPD 1 building chilled water system is being supplied by an OSHPD central plant, are manual isolation valves acceptable as a means for isolation?
If the 1R building?
Yes, if a proposed OSHPD 1R building chilled water system is being supplied by an OSHPD central plant, Are manual isolation valves acceptable as a mean of isolation?
I'm going to have to defer that to the mechanical, but I believe they're going to be automatic shutoff valves are going to be required. The only place I've seen the manual ones are for med gas, because the med gas have to remain operational even after an event. And you can't shut off oxygen or something to a patient that might be on the other side of the wall that's using it. But everything else is going to be an automatic shutoff valve.
Perfect, thank you. Next question. When facilities submit plans for a building to RACs, will OSHPD look into the amount of beds available in the area, etc., and make a determination of whether the hospital will be allowed to RACs? Or can OSHPD require the hospital to upgrade to NPC 5D and 5 instead of RACs?
We won't require it. Again, the question's a little technical, but if you read the first part of that.
Yes, the question reads, when facilities submit plans for a building to RACs, will OSHPD look into the amount of beds available in the area, etc.?
Okay. The RACs project will not have any more beds. So I'm a little confused by the question. The hospital must be able to stand alone already without the building that's being removed from acute care service. All the basic services need to already be in that hospital before you can remove the other building from acute care. When we look at the project, what we're looking at is the utilities. We're looking at the services, make sure all the basic services are in the hospital already, that there's nothing remaining in the RACs building that still would be considered a basic service, unless it is supplemental. If you already meet the requirement for your storage in the hospital, but you're going to put some additional storage in, keep some additional storage in the old building, that's fine. Same thing with the loading docks. You can have a loading dock in the new building, one loading dock, and continue to use the old loading dock in the old building, if that works for you, because it's all supplemental. So as far as beds, there's in theory that unless it's a skilled nursing or a psychiatric, there shouldn't be any patient beds left on the other side. I'd be happy to answer that question in more detail if I had more information.
Perfect. We have an energy code question. How will the energy code be apply if the project has both remodel and addition and it's one continuous space?
The addition space will need to meet the requirements. And again, we have to look at the project specifically. If you have a new air handling HVAC unit, air handling unit serving the entire space, that would need to comply with the new requirements, be it if it was on the remodel side or the expansion side or the addition side. As far as the fenestration, that would have to comply. The chilled water system, if it's existing and just serving the space, you're fine. If you're not touching it, you're fine. If the HVAC unit was on the existing building and had enough capacity to serve the expansion without replacing it, nothing's required at that point. One of the things a lot of people get worried about with the energy code is how much more is this going to cost me? And the reality is, if you're putting in a new HVAC unit, now you're going to meet the requirement of that, because you can't buy them in California without them already complying. And the same with the water heating systems. A lot of these things, the lighting, you're already going in and doing this stuff anyway, like LEDs. We haven't had a project yet where they're swapping out the LEDs for incandescent lights. Everyone's going the other way. So it's all really coming into compliance already. With that, I'm getting the signal that I'm out of time. I thank you all. You'll be receiving a survey in the, actually I think comes out with about an hour after the thing closes. If you can fill that out and provide any information that you think we can do to make this better, we'd appreciate it. If you have any ideas for future webinars, we basically have the whole year booked up for webinars with all kinds of topics that we'll be doing. Remodel CAN will be coming up, new accessibility CAN webinar will be coming up, as well as the 3 additional sessions that we'll be going over. I think I have a slide for that. Yeah, right here. It's in 2 weeks, we have fire life safety. I'll be back for the building code in session 3. And session 4, we're going to have our David Mason and Bill Gow with me doing mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and energy. So again, if you have any ideas or get your questions ready for those, it would be appreciated. We thank you for your time and hope this was helpful. You all take care out there.